Backstage Pass is made possible in part by the MSU Federal Credit Union, a proud supporter of the arts and culture in our local community since 1937. More information on MSU FCU's community involvement is available at msufcu.org/community. And the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts, supporting cultural events in your community. And by donations from viewers like you.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Mama Soul and the Nuts.
Where is the soul?
Backstage Pass, we are Mama Soul and the Nuts. Help me bring my sister Mama Soul to the stage.
Now something happened, something's missing. There's a gap, there's an absence, something drastic if you listen close to the loops and the samples and the words and the raps watered down into gimmicks. Whoa. Now see the rhythm and the message of the brilliant and resilient are restricted from the airwaves. So only choice is sell your soul to make a living or go independent work, get yourself paid. Most don't have it in them, so they battle with this image that really isn't them for a percentage of gross. And now the growth of a younger generation has been stunted in result of an ego and esteem are two totally different things. We're promoted to a team with a dream, though, of becoming what they can, but they can't because they don't understand. Man, where is the soul? WKR, how y'all feeling today? Huh? Y'all alright? Yeah. We in for a good time today, y'all. We might cry a little bit, but we're gonna laugh a whole lot, you hear me? And by no means am I saying that music is a museum full of perfect human beings, but when you're writing and reciting what you're wearing, what you're driving, and not teaching how to get it sucks. For a little kid dreaming to be you and has no clue of all your downs and your ups. Pitfalls, brick walls, bruises, bumps. How you jumped over hurdles, pulled yourself out of slumps, and was once wearing their shoes. Your feet grew. Amazing what some true words can do for the spirit of a listener that's wishing you would lift them up and encourage them. There is much more to living when you're willingly admitting to aspects of life in your past that weren't so bright. Despite potholes and ditches on your road to riches, your goals and your wishes were more important than problems, so your vision didn't blur whenever they did occur. And till those topics are covered in results, souls suffer. The souls of our ancestors hover over us. In order to discuss, where are our leaders? Where is the trust? Where is the love? When will we change? And the question remains.
Soul in the music.
Y'all are so fresh. So you know, how many people here have a dream? Huh? Exactly. That's why you're here building with Mama Soul and the Nuts. So dream on, dreamer. This song is for you.
But at this time, I have the honor to present to you.
Imagine if we all could travel in time, take a tragedy and make it sublime. Mold your moments into perfect design and rewind and define yourself to fit what they had in mind. Begin again and turn your losses to wins. Erase and retrace it this time with a pen. Picture perfect, go ahead and pose and pretend that you never lied, you never cheated or sinned, huh? Not a regret, not a test that you ever failed. Spared of embarrassment, not a secret to tell. Cause everything that you do's on the up and up. Never been weak, you always been tough enough. You never felt the agony of defeat or the need to compete to prove that you were someone unique. No one to please, nothing to strive to achieve. If this was so, then what's the purpose of dreams? So dream on, dreamer. Look, 'cause ain't nobody perfect, so dream on, dreamer. Yeah, so dream on. 'Cause ain't nobody perfect, so dream on, dreamer. Look, life is meant to be bitter and sweet. Experience allows a teacher to teach. Triumph and tragedy, I need it for growth. So coping or quitting, tell me what's your approach, huh? Molding your character and loving yourself, that's the first step I'd imagine in establishing wealth. Seeking your purpose and your meaning for breathing, that's an even better reason to retrain the way that you're thinking. So cut the noose and feed your soul the truth. Making a better you makes a new leader for the youth. Speak what you seek, to what you seek, you see. At that point, everything you said is prophecy. Opportunity is in every mistake. Love is the beauty and balance you have in hate. Ignore the pressure of what other people say. 'Cause in the end, only you can get in your way. Dream on, dreamer. Yeah, 'cause ain't nobody perfect, so dream on, dreamer. Look, dream on. Look, ain't nobody perfect, dream on. Let's be honest, look, now dream on, dreamer. Don't stop for them. You define your design, don't copy them. You are one of a kind, you cannot be them. You'll never be left out when it starts with them. So dream on, dreamer, don't stop for them. You define your design, don't copy them. You are one of a kind, you cannot be them. You'll never be left out. It starts with them, so dream on. 'Cause ain't nobody perfect, so dream on, dreamer. From your dreams, y'all. Don't let that happen, man. This life is about loving life, man. That's what this is about. If you have a dream, man, you know, life is meant to be bitter and sweet. Experience allows a teacher to teach. Triumph and tragedy are needed for growth. So coping or quitting, tell me what's your approach, huh? You have to dream on through all the mess, the nonsense, all of the smoke screens that you all have thrown on you, the youth, man. I'm really here for y'all, truly.
My name is Mama Soul, and I am the lead vocalist for Mama Soul and the Nuts.
You call yourself a goon, then approach a goddess. You ain't even got the slightest chance. I'm just being honest.
Mama Soul, the name itself, I earned that name teaching. I taught at an African-centered school on the east side of Detroit. And in African-centered education, the teachers are addressed as Mama and Baba, which is mother and father in Swahili. And so all of my students call me Mama Soul. And when I quit, I promised my students that I would keep that name for them because they are who helped me heal and helped me find my voice. They are who helped me really find my purpose and my passion. I promised them that I would keep that name for them, Mama Soul. And when I started my band, I always wanted a band called The Nuts.
Break it down, Jude.
People think you're a little bit crazy when you leave a 9-to-5 to pursue a passion, right? And you do have to feel like you're different.
That's real DJing, y'all.
But people will judge that and call you nuts. You're nuts. I heard that so much. You're nuts. You're leaving this good job. And then new under the sun. Because us as humans, we get very comfortable with comparing. And I think comparing something to something just puts you in a comfort zone because we don't like to experience things that take us out of our comfort zone. And what takes us out of our comfort zone is newness. That's why I called it New Under the Sun.
It wasn't no crown in the bag full of hand-me-downs.
Nah.
You gotta earn that on your own.
That's on your own.
That's why it's so
I've
many.
always kind of been involved with rap groups, hip-hop groups, but never a band. But I always enjoyed the live music. Foley, who used to play for Miles Davis and George Clinton and Prince, he played for a lot of different people. He kind of took me under his wing at a very young age and would have me in these bars and sneak me in so that I could perform with a live band, and I fell in love with the element. The way that the music unfolded for me as far as performance was once I started performing, the connection that I had with the people is what reaffirmed that you need to perform more. You have to perform.
All that pill popping, no butt dropper type rap, we done have about enough of that.
I was born and raised in Flint, Michigan, but music was very instrumental in my development as a child. There was always a record player spinning in my house, and I would listen to the old Motown hits and the Stylistics and the Temptations and the Commodores and Stevie Wonder. And my father and relatives had nightclubs and stuff, and so, you know, as we grew up, we would kind of go hang out in different places, and music was always around.
Clap, y'all. Y'all know it's a snippet of a song.
My brother played a lot of hip-hop. Malik exposed me to real hip-hop. He would sit me down like, listen to the lyrics, not just the person, listen to what they're saying. You know, and he would break the lyrics down to songs, and I fell in love with the craft of storytelling and the ability to tell your truth through music.
Hey, I can't say I've always done what's right, but your last mistake's your best teacher, and it felt good. Hindsight, they say it's 2020. My vision blurs from time to time, I get teary-eyed. I be thinking about Charleston 9, yeah, and Amadou Diallo. Sometimes I wish I had a halo. Like Flint water, it's hard to swallow, that's why I tend to lay low. I'm sensitive, I don't talk much, and I'm socially selective. Keep my energy protected. It's a lot I'm not impressed with. I don't care about award shows or overpriced wardrobes. Was God the judge to determine if you get a trophy? Cause that's a real image award. Yeah, that'll make mama so proud. But when your esteem's high like a picket sign, you stick out in the crowd. But in this heartless market, you'll be a target if you don't love who you are. We grew in the gutter like bowling balls. We all want the juice like Orenthal. Sell my soul for a standing applause, that's far from what I'm on. I be light bearing, light seeking, doing things for the right reason. I study roots, plant seeds, I'll bloom when it's my season. Summer, fall, winter, spring, back from a loss. I've been a boss, your interview of my outer shell will not affect my pay.
No way.
I've been the truth and only time to tell you, so the heck with what they say, because I love life. Whatever comes my way, it's gonna be a better day. I ain't tripping, I'm okay. I love life, no matter what they say. Just keep it moving and pray. Everything will be okay. You gotta love life. Whatever comes my way, it's gonna be a better day. I ain't tripping, I'm okay. I love life, no matter what they say. We gonna keep it moving and pray. Everything will be okay. We gotta love life. I've always done what's right. Your last mistake's your best teacher, and it felt good. Hindsight, they say it's 2020. My vision blurs from time to time, I get teary-eyed. I be thinking about Charleston 9 and Amadou Diallo. Sometimes I wish I had a halo. Like Flint water, it's hard to swallow, that's why I tend to lay low. I'm sensitive, I don't talk much, I'm socially selective. Keep my energy protected. It's a lot I'm not impressed with. I don't care about award shows or overpriced wardrobes. Was God the judge to determine if you get a trophy? Cause that's a real image award. That'll make mama so proud. But when your esteem's high like a picket sign, you stick out in the crowd. But in this heartless market, you'll be a target if you don't love who you are. We grew in the gutter like bowling balls. We all want the juice like Orenthal. But to sell my soul for a standing applause, that's far from what I'm on. I be light bearing, light seeking, doing things for the right reason. I study roots, plant seeds, I'll bloom when it's my season. Summer, fall, winter, spring, back from a loss. I've been a boss, and your interview of my outer shell will not affect my pay. I've been the truth and only time to tell you, so the heck with what they say, because I love life. Whatever comes my way, it's gonna be a better day. I ain't tripping, I'm okay, cause I love life. No no matter what they say. Just keep it moving and pray. Everything will be okay. You got love life. Hey, whatever comes my way, it's gonna be a better day. I ain't tripping, I'm okay. You got love life. Whatever they gon' say, you just keep it moving and pray. Everything will be okay, y'all. We gotta love life. That felt good, right? I'm thankful, man. Just so thankful. Let's get into thankful. I wrote this song in the refugee camps in Africa. I was in Kenya, Mogadishu, Dadaab, and Somalia during the drought. So listen to the first line that comes out my mouth and then think about me being from Flint. See, I'm thankful for the fact that I could turn on a tap and have fresh water. And I'm thankful for the thought of being grateful because I ought to show appreciation for how I was brought up. I'm the daughter of a dope man, but a mother who's a saint, who taught me give thanks through the bad and the good, keep faith. Hope floats so our boat never sank. See, I'm thankful for that cheese even hell couldn't melt in that cardboard box, but we ate. And I'm thankful for the sugar water, milk made from powder in the big white box, but we drank. See, I'm thankful for the heat from the sun, light from the moon, the spirit of a person that just lights up a room. See, I'm thankful for a smile, a hug, a tweet from a fan showing love. I appreciate any and all positive energy. Honestly, I'm even grateful for my enemies, because they're keeping me aware of who really cares. I got a small circle without any squares, yeah. For the air that I breathe, I'm grateful. For the fruit from the trees, I'm grateful. For their nourishment, and through the tough times, words of encouragement, thank you. Anybody here that's grateful for something, just put one. Just one finger. Something, just grateful for something. Yes. And point, man. Thank you. You know, now drop them down. Yeah, see, I'm thankful for every surgery that worried me, for every person that encouraged me. Keep fighting, keep focused, keep flourishing. You never go without when you go within. I'm grateful for knowledge of self, for my health, and that I'm able to assist someone else. Because when you give love, love multiplies. I'm thankful for a five that I slapped with a person in passing that just felt my vibe.
What's up, son?
For a handshake, a pound, a nod. For a fist to the sky or a simple peace sign, that's a sign I received from God. You see, I'm thankful for a close parking space, for an artist with the talent such as Drake, for the courage of Kanye, the knowledge of D1 and Nas, because they all influenced my son, and I'm grateful. For the small things in life, like the flick of a switch, which then appears light, I'm grateful. From the bottom of my heart, for my hearing, for my touch, for my taste and my sight, I am overwhelmed by the beauty of a butterfly out of cocoon, by a flower in bloom, I'm grateful. And for all of y'all, I'm thankful. Thank you. One more time, because it just looks so good. Everybody that's grateful or thankful for something. One more time. Ooh, see that unity? You see how that unity is? That one love? Now I'll turn that one into an L. Yeah, one love, one light, man. Yes, yes, yes. I'm so grateful, man.
My writing process varies. There can be a situation that's happening in my life, and I'll sit down and say, I need to write about it. But I like to write alone. I don't like to sit in a studio full of people and the music's playing and I'm writing. I like to write alone. It's a peaceful thing for me. I normally write most of my music early in the morning, like 5, 6, 7 a.m. I think it's very important as an artist to connect with people's truths. And that if something that I went through can bring you out of that space, you know, and let's deal with each other for real, for real. Oh man, our connection as a band is like, we really are family. Like, we cry together, we laugh together, we fuss, we fight, you know, like siblings. We enjoy performing. Like, we get a lot out of the performance and the crowd. Trust, we get as much from these shows as the audience does. The song Shine, literally, I was in Flint during the border crisis, and I was so depressed. And so, you know, I was in this space. And I said, I'm gonna write myself out of this space.
The star don't make the light is what creates a star, so shine inside.
There's so many reminders in that song, you know. And I tell them, we all get under pressure, but consider us diamonds. Just turn around if you feel you're at the end of the line, and then you'll be in the front. It's about the way that you see stuff that'll change the way that you feel about it. I know it gets rough, but a mountain can't be climbed without them bumps, true? You just keep sliding right back down if it was all smooth.
Inhale the good, exhale the bad. Turn can to can and your dreams to plans.
You have to go through things in order to get to where you want to be, but you can't quit. And in the song, I say every winner took a loss, but every loser ain't no winner. It's a cost that's gonna come with it. Stay committed to your gift. You're not gonna get if you don't give. Some grind, some sweat, and some tears till it's your time to shine. Shine, man, this song is just, you know, I hold it very dear because on this new album, I think that song catapulted the energy of the whole new project.
The brighter ones, but you gotta be conscious of the darkness where it started from and work extra hard. Keep faith in God. The star don't make the light is what creates a star. So shine inside, Ashe, inside, Namaste, Amen Ra, Alhamdulillah. Everybody won't make that flight. Everybody won't take this right. My flows impose souls of those that are in search of light. So inhale the good, exhale the bad. Turn can to can and your dreams to plans. Cock your crown, rock it proud. You gotta know you royal for the love of the blood that was shed by those that came before you. No, our freedom ain't free. So many died for this, sis. You were born a goddess. Please don't die, it's no bad. My bros, just know you ain't gold plated, you gold. You solid. Acknowledge that inside of you is where God is and shine. And you are beautiful, baby. You are.
Yes, you are.
You are royalty, brother, you are.
Yes, you are.
And you are excellent, sister, you are.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
And we're all warriors. Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
Magnificent, glorious. Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
And always victorious. Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
We all get under pressure, but consider us diamonds.
Shining.
Just turn around if you feel you at the end of the line, man, and then you'll be in the front. It's about the way that you see stuff that change the way that you feel about it. I know it gets rough. A mountain can't be climbed without them bumps. True. You just keep sliding right back down if it was all smooth. So tiptoe that tightrope, keep balance, baby, you beaming. Your head up and your chest poked, and you be who you believe in. Keep dreaming, keep working, keep living, keep loving. It's coming, I can feel it in my stomach. If it doesn't, it's a reason. Maybe it just ain't your season. Keep pushing, keep cooking, let it simmer. Don't be quitting, no, cause every winner took a loss. But every loser ain't no winner, it's a cost.
It's a cost.
That's gonna come with it, stay committed to your gift.
That's your gift.
You ain't gonna get if you don't give your grind, your sweat, and your tears till it's your time to shine. You are beautiful. You are.
Yes, you are.
You are royalty. royalty, sister, you are.
Yes, you are.
And you are excellence, brother, you are.
Yes, you are. Hey, yes, you are.
And it's our time to shine, cause we're all warriors. Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
Magnificent, glorious. Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
And always victorious. Yes, we are. Yes, we are. And it's our time to shine. Oh, man. Give thanks. Give thanks, man. Oh, give thanks. Man, I write these songs sometime, y'all. I'm so human. And I'm an empath, y'all. I feel. That's why I can't just be anywhere. Because I care, man. Oh, I care. If one of y'all was going through something and this helped you, my job is done. I truly appreciate this opportunity. I gained it. Just come and build with y'all. Because so many claim they keep it real with y'all. But I beg to differ, dear. If over there they keep it real, well, over here I keep it rare, and you can love a hater. Because not too many really got what it takes. See, my trust is like an eraser. It gets smaller after mistakes. I study history and hieroglyphics and then pyramids, and my intention is to inspire these little kids with my dialogue. Who wants to die alone? Like Trayvon, Mike Brown. Who wants to die alone? Who determines all the sermons and the choir songs? And if they fail, whose shoulders are they crying on? Probably the person whose actions match their words and then surpass them. And so I push with passion in my pen as I began to proceed with God-given optimism. Not too much worries me in the 810, where so many claim to be killers, but I ain't one, no. See, I'm a lover, a soldier, a liberator, a friend, but I'm a mother, and I'm a warrior ready for revolution on the front line. But in the meantime, the sun is the only one that I've been trying to outshine. See, what you fear and afraid of is really a reflection of what you're made of, and your only ultimatum is meeting your maker. When you fake, and so do you. It's so much easier for a king to spread a lie than a beggar to spread the truth. See, this is for your body, mind, and spirit. Clear it out. We've arrived. Got a lot of Asada Shakur. Got a lot of Asada in her. And the will to survive. Right now, we learn very little from lyricists that are left to lead us and bleed. How did hunger become this term we learn to use for greed? Have you ever seen the bloated bellies of babies born with the burden of starvation from the day that they're torn from their mother's womb? Or are we too consumed with ourselves to consider the living conditions of somebody else? Then sit down and write a song with verses with some substance and purpose.
I ain't nervous neither. I mean, this either help us or hurt us. Right now, we need some leaders, learners, historians, teachers, lawyers, and warriors, politicians, some doctors and dentists. We need chemists cooking cures for diseases they give us, as opposed to cooking crack, because that just leads to addiction. And the sad thing, the sickness we suffer from is self-inflicted, and this ain't what God intended for the ones that's in his image. See, I think surely like a jury with verdicts the way I word it. And then I serve it on this silver platter with a superside of courage. It's sickening. But the public speakers that are spilling out our speakers are weak as water and leave us no leaders for sons and daughters. And then they label them Generation X with no tribute to Malcolm. Salute to troops that made it through, but still, what is the outcome? When some still spill blood on foreign battlefields and their families crying, missing, wishing they had them still. See, when the next man's down, do you kick him? Or give him a hand to lift him, or leave him laying? Who's the victim? Really, it's us, because there's power in numbers. And hate's only hurting the hater when he's hating himself. So I wonder, do them balloons and teddy bears on them telephone poles heighten humility or lead to more selling of souls? So I exercise daily and balance out my behavior by watching what I engage in. This universe is amazing as it unfolds. I embrace change as the sun glows. Through these dark shades, my windows of opportunity open. I focus all my energy on what I intend to be. They said history repeats. Contradictive, but a dreamer never sleeps. The sweet taste of victory is addictive, and the only person in which I compete with is me. But my emotional roller coaster is steep. And as I climb it, I'm reminded that I'm shining, because my aura, how they gravitate toward her in them streets. I'm God's daughter in the belly of the beast. And this was written in the memory of Sandra Bland. See, when the enemy is all that stands, and when the Panther Party is a thing of the past, but the police protect the Klan when they rally. And sadly, I have seen kings dethroned by his own, and I would gladly give a limb like a leg or arm if Trayvon wasn't buried. They are legally allowed to lie. I just wish he could have told his side. But when the chance of defeating the odds are really slim to none, what do I tell my son? When a gun's been drawn and he's done no wrong, is it fate? Do you fight? Do you run? I ain't seen much change since days when the slaves worked fields in the sweltering sun. And rebellion is seldomly seen. This system will sell you a dream for the price of your soul. What a sight to behold. It is time we unite or we fold. I'm gonna do a lyrical exercise for you real quick. How many of you like lyrics? Huh? This new generation, y'all know y'all don't like no lyrics. Y'all know y'all don't like no lyrics. That's why y'all listen to the best y'all listen to, because they talk about nothing. But give thanks. You came to a Mama Soul in a Nut Show. You're gonna get you some lyrics today, you hear me? You gonna learn today about what real hip hop is. Huh? All right. Yeah. Eyes open, giving thanks, yep, my day started. Joy cometh in the morning, baby, okay, I got it. Dedication and determination, I'm driven, man. Yeah, I'm winning, so we spinning just like a ceiling fan. To whom much is given, much is taking a toll on them. But instead of quitting, they just lifted the load on them. God's grace and replacing feeling hate and occasional anal fakes. In my face, I'm feeling great. Getting green like a clover with 4 leaves on it. Luckily staying sucker free by all means, homie. Sunny skies, I predicted my forecast. Butterfly from a caterpillar cocooned in a room full of killers, dropouts, and drug dealers, to a room full of fans that fell in love with her. Thank God I could change. Ain't harder for change or approval. Choose to remain me. I'm a motivator and a educator. Then I'm ordering my dinner, player. I ain't a waiter. More flavor than now and laters. I could probably concerts to sponsor my concerts. I'm an innovator. Conceited, not in the slightest. I'm just aware that my gift is guided by freedom fighters from Huey Newton to Swift. I'm a different kind of creature. Flow is 1 in a million in memory of Aaliyah. We need a couple leaders, indeed. I see it, I'll be it. I either win or I learn in return. I'm never defeated.
If I said it, then I'll repeat it. But wherever I got the gossip, I drop it there and leave it. I don't do a lot of talking. I do a lot of doing, like I'm reciting wedding vows. They owls, they head turning. Who ain't go to Mama Soul Music and get down with the movement or move it. Either make a way or in the way you lose it. Get to choosing. While I'm black, blue, and bruising the beat, get your schooling. Student pad and pen and pull up a C, show improving. You can say the booing for Halloween, get the cheering. This over here, sort of supreme perseverance player. Meditation prayer. My homies told me, yo, so it's time you take it there. I stepped up my game while they stare at the stairs. It's a steep climb for weak minds, better prepare. I did it, karate kidded, I full press in the scrimmage. Admitted I'm cold dope, quitting I won't know. Fitted form and motive for medals, merits, and plaques from snapbacks to fitted. I'll see where your head is at. Much more fedora when picture when literature and got lyrics galore with a shout out to Lauren. How critics confuse crazy with maturins, like Tiger Woods saying Kablasian was his origin. More than rappers need Oscars, meaning Oscar might have sponsors since they only selling baloney. It's a given, this is uncommon. Come with them commas if they think that I'm signing. If not, we continue this independent grind like bad break pass, taking advantage of every chance, makes chance. So driven like I'm an Andretti with a pen. There's never a finish line. Rewind, play it again.
Most of my songs are close to my heart because that's where they come from. The rap industry and the music, man, it's a very male-dominated industry. And being a female, not just being a female, because we do have female rappers. We have Nicki Minaj, and we have Remy Ma, we have Lauryn Hill, but it's still a male-dominated industry. You know, end of the day, we need balance because there are little girls that need someone to look up to. I'm a mother. I look at all my sisters as queens, and I think when queendom come, you have to be ready for that. Tonight, I'll be performing several songs that are very dear to me. The Hard to Swallow piece, I'll do that. That's very dear to me.
I'm grateful for my parents, for Flint.
Hard to Swallow is exactly that. And I titled it that because the whole Flint water crisis, that's a tough pill to swallow when you're living through that crisis. It's different when you don't live in Flint. We need to tell our story, and we need to tell it from a perspective of someone that's living through this.
I'm from Flint, Michigan, just like y'all. For real. And growing up in Flint, Michigan, you know, you have to move the clouds yourself sometime and remind yourself the sun is behind these clouds. I just have to keep going. They'll move.
And I study African proverbs because they help me. They're simple little like one-liners of wisdom, right? And so I was reading some African proverbs, and immediately I thought of Flint. The darker the night, the brighter the star. And then I started processing that, you know, and then I added the harder the fight, the stronger we are to it myself. But I started processing that. The darker the light, the brighter the star, you know. And you look into the sky, and it's just like, man, darkness, but that star that's in that darkness shines so bright. And you value it at night. Like, look at the stars. Like, wow. That connected me with Flint. I just felt like, you know, we all are these balls of energy and light. And people are seeking that. And so I wrote Hard to Swallow for my city and for us, because I've been a voice there, and this is not a time for me to be quiet. Yeah. I wrote Hard to Swallow for Flint.
But we come in peace, with the intent to increase and restore hope for the hopeless, and love is the focus. I pray that this message will reach far beyond them clouds. God, we need you involved now. Your spirit is needed, so this isn't repeated. Why is it like this, a crisis? I've cried with my right fist lifted for my brothers and sisters. These little kids are becoming statistics. The Tuskegee experiment, like they did with syphilis. Honestly, I'm questioning if this was intended. What made them go and change the water source that Flint gets? Answer me that. Emergency management, obvious fact. Your family's not residents of the city affected by your lack of concern. Inappropriate protocol, you're cutting your costs, but what's the sense of saving money, though, when lives are lost? And now these corrupt cover-ups, they hiding the facts. They had the mayor drink a cup and tell us all to relax. And then put that on the news because it's legal to lie. To the public and the media, we need a reply, Mr. President. Your government is governing suffering, got a governor whose only defense is his incompetence. He could have stopped it. Instead, he said, go ahead. He gave him the green light, knowing the pipes was loaded with lead that would flow into the ghetto without warning that the poison that was pouring through the metal had no control of corrosion. Hold up. What they hoped that we wouldn't notice. But thank you, Dr. Mona. Respect, Virginia Tech, for putting Flint on your shoulders and did it with no regret. Man, that water was brown. It reeked like rotten eggs. Our babies can't bathe, but the bill gotta be paid. This is blatant terrorism. Premeditated murder, you deserve to go to prison. And anybody with you. The politicians getting richer, our babies getting sicker. Hair loss, skin rashes, anemia, brain damage, not to mention Legionnaires, and what brings me to tears are the victims with the symptoms that won't appear till years from now. How you explain it and define it? It's cultural genocide at its finest, but be reminded we've been fighting all our lives. And the darker the night, the brighter the star. The harder the fight, the stronger we are. And we're strictly business and we also got our pride. And if you don't like it, I suggest you break wide. I want to again thank PBS and WKAR for getting that message out to the world. They came to Flint in the midst of the crisis. They have been very supportive. And we did an interview, and I shared that piece with them. And when I say they played it all over, they have played that, and so many thousands of people have heard our voice. I have a responsibility to y'all, to be a voice for the voiceless, to be hope for the hopeless. And again, I just thank them. I'm so grateful for them, man. And so, you know, I tell the truth because I can't misguide you and make it seem like, oh, everything has always been cool and I know how to find the solution and not stay in the problem and detach myself emotionally and all these cool things that I've learned, right? But I've learned them only so I can give them back. So what I did a pilgrimage around pyramids and got in tune with Kaloon. Made meditation my medication, overstood instead of assumed. It's apparent, their parrots repeat whatever they hear and see, and the only way to grow doing that is the karaoke me. It's sad to say, but they so behind that they think they in the league. They pop Warner, we prime time, we in a whole nother league. We fail to fail and they fail to figure out a way not to fall. In the same lane with them same lames, they swore knew it all. See, they walk, crawled, and sat still. We chill, planned, and then ran with it. Marathon, no batons, no handouts, and no rush. Like laughter at the library now, cause we stand out and you hush. We stand up with no crutch. Ice cold, no slush. Hammer had it right when he danced, and them big pants don't touch the divine rhyme. I like fine china, y'all step back and observe. They so concerned with hers, put myself in third eye view, so superb. Got clear vision, clairvoyance, intuition, discipline, and a few friends that know the love run thicker than blood that don't even need mentioning. And it's y'all know what? Look, it's something about these beats, something about these rhymes, something about my team, and something about the time. Feels like we down one, ball in hand, but I'm LeBron. And my coach somewhere in the air with a throne, is chair and a magic wand. Yeah, I'm God's girl. I was meant to be. I'ma give you her story, so in history you'll mention me. I'm the necessary Malcolm meant by any means. I'm the morning after Mr. Martin Luther dream. I write these raps in the seat in the back where Rosa sat. All that pill popping, old butt dropping type rap, we done had about enough of that. I never really been into being like them, I prefer me. My head down to my feet, my smile, my style come out when I speak. I broke rules, rewrote some, I paid dues, I owe some. I'm quite bright, my flow dumb. Want love, you better show some. What you give is what you get. Your 2 cent Keep that and let it stack, I'm getting rich. We magnify magnificence and we the upper echelon. Yet still our best is yet to come. I've been an old soul like shell toes, that's word to Rev Run. They took the path, I took the grass, I made my own lane. I'm super cool, used to keep the propane, it ain't for no games. So don't try to beat me like diabetes, baby, ain't nothing sweet. If I call my side, you'll see the other side of my family tree. And how the fruit fell like Fruitvale, see the system failed mine. But the bloodline so royal, loyalty, we bleed black oil. I'm certified, you heard about me in Flint, I run the town. Quite like the crim and put family over this bread like Altamont. Come on. Something about these beats. Something about these beats. Something about these rhymes. Something about these rhymes. Something about my team. Something about my team. Something about the time. Feels like we down one, ball in hand, but I'm LeBron. And my coach somewhere in the air with a throne his chair and a magic wand. Cause I'm God's girl. I was meant to be. I'm gonna give you her story, so in history you'll mention me. I'm the necessary Malcolm meant by any means. I'm the morning after Mr. Martin Luther's dream. I write these raps on a seat in the back where Rosa sat. All that pill popping, no butt dropping type rap, we done have all another man. Ain't nobody taking this from us. And when I tell you we travel state to state, city to city, repping Flint, Michigan, tough. Tough. And we let them know this here is ours. That's Juice. That's Famadou. That's Bug on bass. Sound kind of funky, ain't it? That's Hollywood over there on keys. That's G-Dash over there on that organ. Complaints, but more compliments to both I give thanks. They double our dominance, and either way I'm on your mind. And yeah, my rhymes don't always speak the volume I'd prefer, but that's fine. Y'all tell them turn it up a tad. My self-esteem is high, roll and burn you up a bag. Try and catch me on a cloud, soul sync with the Orion. Star Belt, Skywalk, now check out my alignment. Yeah, that's fly talk, I exhale helium. All about my green, sorta like Mo Pete and them. I'm the main ingredient to make a mean meal, and I don't even need no deal. I play the cards God dealt, and I play them heartfelt. Now you call yourself a goon, then approach a goddess. You ain't even got the slightest chance. I'm just being honest. I'm a walking monsoon, making this charade of pompous poets take a break and bring the rain on they parade. It's about time for a change. I ain't talking dollar for a quarter or exchange. Y'all ain't got a problem, y'all ain't scared for our future. When a man wears tights and dyes his whole head fuchsia, I got a son to raise, I'm banging Frankie Beverly. I'ma keep him out that maze, half woman, half amazing. Kuji Chagalia, meaning self-determination. All dues paid except the most highest praises, and I do that on the daily. This is field literature. Y'all ain't got a cotton picking clue what we gon' do. A bit too much for you to chew. Not a smidgen of their miniature. Minuscule minstrel show approach to being dope to me is weak as selling soap, and I can sense defeat in the air, so let them soak. This ain't a joint if you can't beat her affair. I got my folk. I ain't looking for no new comrades. I'm content with Bug, Juice, Farmer, Dre, and Dash. Ain't gotta ask who my crew is, who I stick my neck out for. Keep my circle tight as a turtleneck. Play blackboard and chalk it up as a loss. I'm like an onk to a cross. We different as life and death. I'm enlightened, they turn them off. Oh no, I am not here for your applause nor awards. I got brothers from the 5th Ward that will clap. So revisit that metaphor that I met you before. So we should link up and stuff I ignore. More of us, meaning Mama Soul and the Nuts. Less of that, well, for lack of a better term, for the garbage they write. For now, we'll call it rap, but take them to church. We here to make friends. We here to make change. And I ain't talking dollar for a quarter exchange. We tried to share, but they ain't prepared. So pardon us barging in on what they thought was their job, but this here's all. This here's all. How that feel? Feel all right? Huh? Let me tell y'all one more time. Look, we ain't here to make friends. We're here to make change. And I ain't talking dollar for a quarter exchange. We tried to share, but they ain't prepared. So pardon us barging in on what they thought was their job, but this here's all. The things we go through together, they prepare you for the outcome. So regardless of what is happening in your life, whatever occurs, you're prepared. Whatever the outcome may be, we're prepared. Give thanks. Just take a moment. Just take a moment. Ashe. You know, they say that if you knew better, you do better. And once you know, you grow and turn into this go-getter. Or do you contemplate the risk and slowly lose grip, letting opportunity slip between your fingertips, unaware that failing is a very healthy portion of success? See, we got choices like birth or abortion. It often comes to this. But I ain't talking babies, baby. No, I'm talking mission. Abort the mission or give birth to awesomeness and vision. See, you can wake another dreamer when you live in yours. Shake them and show them the meaning of being slept on. See, when they suggested we quit, that's when we kept on. Now this pillow talk is paying off all this debt for them. We kept working when you wasn't wishing the best for them. Now we're forced to be reckoned with and regrets gone. The skepticism, it was fuel for the jet's engine, and honestly, their opinion is never really worth a response. Very limited leeway to see the snakes when it's growing long, so we bought a mower and they couldn't show it with lower lawns. See, when your songs personify the et ceteras in your lives, I can tell it's in your eyes. And the real you is really ducking and hiding behind them lines. Well, I see that as deceiving penguin and won't let it fly. Not believing the sweet talk and eating the devil's pie. See, queens, we feast in the kingdom. You supersize your fries on a budget and add nuggets to number fives. But exactly what point do you start to realize that life without love is just death in disguise, and love without trust is really lust? And surprisingly enough, it ain't enough for us to portion our pie, where everybody gets a slice or even crumbs from the crust. See, not everybody saw the cross and said, hey, let's all ante up. Or even offered ingredients when we needed them most. But bad biscuits make the baker go broke, bro. You know we got a mean flavor. And the taste of success is sweet. So now we got them Indiana Pacers because they couldn't handle the heat. See, they count the seeds in the apple, but not the apples in the seed. Now plant that in your memory and see how many you feed off the fruits of your labor, player, hunger, or greed. See, the helping hand that we need is at the end of our sleeves, so when I ask you for favors, bear witness to greatness and of the gifts that God gave us. Watch how far that it takes us, because we're here. Thank y'all.
For more about Backstage Pass, including full episodes to watch anywhere, visit the series website at WKAR.org. Follow Backstage Pass from WKAR on Facebook and Twitter. Backstage Pass was made possible in part by the MSU Federal Credit Union, a proud supporter of the arts and culture in our local community since 1937. More information on MSU FCU's community involvement is available at msufcu.org/community. And the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts, supporting cultural events in your community. And by donations from viewers like you.